The rain in Chicago did not merely fall that Tuesday evening. It arrived as a physical weight, a cold, relentless sheets of water that seemed determined to scrub the grime from the city's soul. For Benjamin Adams, a 34-year-old veteran of the Chicago Fire Department, the weather was a familiar adversary. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic gait down Michigan Avenue, his boots echoing against the wet pavement. He had just finished a grueling 24-hour shift at Engine 42, a shift that had seen him crawling through the blackened remains of a warehouse on the south side, the heat still radiating from his skin even hours later. Benjamin was a man of significant stature, standing 6'2", with shoulders broadened by years of hauling heavy hoses and carrying the weight of oxygen tanks. His face was a map of his experiences, a faint scar running through his left eyebrow from a shattered window in 19, and eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. As he walked, he pulled his collar up against the wind, his mind drifting to the quiet of his small apartment and the cold beer waiting in his fridge. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble on his time off. He had seen enough of it to last 3 lifetimes. Yet, the city had a way of pulling him back into the fray just when he thought he was out of the heat. The magnificent mile was a blur of neon and steel. But as Benjamin turned toward the more shadowed alleys near the Gold Coast, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of high-end traffic faded, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of gutters and the distant, lonely siren of a police cruiser. It was there, in the mouth of a narrow passage between 2 towering boutiques, that he heard a sharp, staccato gasp that cut through the white noise of the storm. Jennifer Miller, 39, was a woman who lived her life in the high-frequency hum of corporate boardrooms and private jets. As the CEO of Sterling Global Logistics, she was accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. But in this damp, lightless alley, her status was a liability. She had taken a wrong turn, her mind preoccupied with a failing merger. And now, she found herself pinned against a rough brick wall. Her attacker was a young man, barely 20, his eyes wide with a frantic, jittery energy that suggested he was more afraid of his own desperation than of her. He was tugging at the strap of her Hermes bag, his movements clumsy and violent. Jennifer's breath came in ragged bursts, her expensive silk scarf damp and clinging to her throat. She tried to scream, but the cold air seemed to swallow the sound before it could leave her lips. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the risks or consider the legalities. He simply moved. It was a muscle memory born of a decade in the service. He didn't run into the alley like an amateur. He entered with a calculated, heavy presence that immediately changed the gravity of the situation. The young man looked up, his face pale under the flickering amber glow of a security light. Benjamin stood at the entrance, his silhouette filling the space, his hands open but ready. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried more authority than any siren. He told the kid that the night was too cold for a prison cell and that the bag was UNA worth the decade of life he was about to throw away. There was a moment of agonizing stillness. The only sound, the patter of rain on the trash bins. The boy's hands shook, and with a sudden, panicked sob, he dropped the bag and scrambled past Benjamin, vanishing into the gray curtains of the rain. Jennifer slumped against the wall, her knees finally giving out. Benjamin moved to her side with the practiced gentleness of a man who had held the hands of the dying. He checked her for injuries, his fingers light on her pulse, his voice soft as he walked her through a grounding exercise. As Jennifer regained her composure, the reality of her savior began to settle in. She saw a man who looked like he belonged to another era, a man of soot and grit and quiet strength. However, the habits of a lifetime are hard to break. As she stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her designer trench coat, she felt the old impulse to categorize and control. She reached into her bag, her fingers finding the thick envelope of cash she had intended for a high-end charity auction. She pulled out a stack of hundreds, her hand trembling as she thrust them toward Benjamin. She told him that she didn't like to be in debt, that this was a gratuity for his intervention. Benjamin looked at the money, then at the woman whose world was built on the exchange of currency for value. He didn't feel insulted. He felt a profound sense of pity. He gently pushed her hand away, telling her that in his neighborhood, you didn't charge people for being a neighbor. He told her his name was Benjamin and that she should get home and lock her door. He walked away before she could even offer a business card, his figure dissolving into the mist, leaving Jennifer standing in the rain with a handful of money that suddenly felt like lead. In the days that followed, Jennifer couldn't shake the image of the man in the rain. Her life was a series of transactions, of people who wanted something from her and people she paid to provide it. Benjamin Adams was a variable she couldn't account for. She used her connections in the city's civil service to track him down, Eventually finding his name on a list of decorated firefighters, she felt a strange compulsion to prove that her world was superior, that she could improve him if she just gave him enough opportunity. She arrived at Engine 42 on a Friday morning, her black sedan idling at the curb like a dark omen. She found Benjamin in the kitchen of the station, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, surrounded by the boisterous laughter of his crew. When she walked in, the room went silent. She looked like a creature from another planet, tall silken diamonds in a room of sweat and chrome. She invited him to dinner at Alinea, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, framing it as a professional thank you. Benjamin, sensing that she wouldn't stop until she had checked the box of paying him back, reluctantly agreed. The dinner was a study in contrasts. Jennifer was in her element, navigating the complex etiquette of a 12-course tasting menu, while Benjamin sat stiffly in his best flannel shirt, his hand scarred and rough feeling out of place among the delicate crystal. As they talked, Jennifer tried to steer the conversation toward his career. She spoke of upscaling his life, mentioning that her company needed a head of security with a salary that would dwarf his current earnings. She spoke of potential and optimization, her voice smooth and persuasive. Benjamin listened, his expression unreadable, until she made the mistake of assuming his simplicity was a lack of ambition. He told her that he didn't need to be optimized, and that a man who spends his days saving lives does unneed to spend his nights guarding a vault. The tension was palpable. Benjamin mentioned he had to leave early to run errands, and Jennifer's curiosity sharpened by her suspicion that he was hiding a darker side led her to follow him. She trailed him to a gritty part of the city, watching from her car as he entered a small, fluorescent-lit grocery store. She saw him come out with several bags, including 2 bottles of expensive bourbon. Her mind immediately leaped to the worst conclusion. She assumed he was taking a refusal of the money and spending his own meager earnings on a vice. She confronted him in the parking lot, her voice sharp with disappointment, accusing him of wasting his life and his character on the bottle. Benjamin didn't snap back. He invited her to follow him to his final destination. They drove to a quiet, wind-swept cemetery on the outskirts of the city. There, under the shadow of a weeping willow, Benjamin knelt at a grave. He used the flour and sugar he had bought to polish the headstone, a trick he had learned to keep the marble bright. He placed the bourbon on the ledge, explaining that it was for his brother Joshua, who had died in a fire 3 years ago today. He told her that he didn't drink the bourbon. He shared it with the only man who ever truly knew his heart. Jennifer stood in the biting wind, the silence of the graves around her, realizing for the first time that her wealth was a very small thing in the face of such a large and quiet grief. The silence of the cemetery was a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped around Jennifer, making the clicking of her expensive heels feel like a desecration against the hallowed ground. She watched Benjamin S. Hensta, same hands that had fended off a criminal and steadied her trembling frame now, gently tracing the letters of his brother Esnin with a reverence that she had never seen applied to anything in her fast-paced material world. The arrogance she had worn like a suit of armor for the last decade began to crack, revealing a vulnerability she had allowed herself to feel since she first took the helm of her father's empire. She realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that her initial judgment of him buying alcohol wasn't merely a fleeting mistake, but was rather a symptom of a deeper, and turned his gaze toward the distant horizon where the jagged silhouette of the Chicago skyline glittered like a chaotic pile of discarded jewels set against the bruising purple and charcoal smear of the fading twilight. He proceeded to tell her, with a voice devoid of malice, but heavy with resignation, that Joshua was undeniably the better man, the one with the bright, promising future and the easy, infectious laugh, while he was simply the one left behind to carry the heavy torch and recount the tragic story of a life cut short. And although Jennifer tried to speak, her voice catching painfully in her throat as the cold, biting wind whipped her hair across her face, Benjamin just waved off her protestations with a weary grace, explaining that people in her elevated position often forgot that the most valuable things in life were those purchased at a sterile auction, but rather those earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of quiet, unnoticed sacrifice that never asks for a receipt, thanking her for the dinner while making it devastatingly clear that their worlds were separated by an ocean of experience that no bridge built of money could ever hope to cross. Yet, Jennifer. Miller was not a woman who accepted no as a final answer, especially when her conscience was finally waking up from a long, profitable slumber, so determined to make amends and perhaps sensing a strange magnetic pull to Benjamin's unwavering integrity. She didn't offer him a handout this time, but instead offered him a project that required the one thing she knew he respected: hard work, explaining that her sprawling estate in Lake Forest, a massive limestone manor that felt more like a cold museum than a warm home, was undergoing extensive structural renovations that had stalled due to incompetent contractors, and she needed someone with an eye for safety, someone who understood the bones of a building and how heat and air move through a space, to oversee the final stages of the electrical and structural overhaul, framing it as a professional consultation that would allow him to use his firefighter-esque expertise on his days off to ensure the place would unbecome a death trap. Although Benjamin was initially hesitant, his pride bristling at the uncomfortable thought of becoming a wealthy woman's pet project. The reality was that his firefighter-esque salary was stretched dangerously thin by the mounting medical bills for his mother's specialized memory care, making the opportunity practical to ignore even if the setting felt alien to him. Thus, he began spending his weekends at the Sterling estate, swapping his heavy fire gear for a worn tool belt and a pair of sturdy work gloves, working with a quiet, focused intensity that fascinated the household staff, who were used to contractors who spent more time on their phones than on the job. While Jennifer found herself inventing reasons to stay home on Saturdays, watching him from the second-floor balcony as he meticulously repaired the ancient masonry of the terrace or inspected the attic wiring with a clinical eye, seeing a man who took pride in every nail driven and every board planed, a man who treated her home with more respect than the elite socialites she usually invited to her gala dinners. During their lunch breaks, which they often shared on the back porch, the barriers began to lower as Benjamin spoke of the brotherhood of the firehouse, of the terrifying beauty of a backdraft, and the heavy silence that follows a successful rescue, while Jennifer in turn spoke of the crushing pressure of her legacy, the loneliness of the penthouse, and the fear that she was nothing more than the sum of her stock options, creating an illusion for a few weeks that two people from vastly different galaxies were finally finding a common language. However, the peace of the Lake Forest estate was a thin, fragile veil over a rotting core that Benjamin sensed long before Jennifer did for her husband. Matthew Gonzalez, a man of 42, who possessed the kind of manufactured charm that felt like a polished blade, beautiful to look at, but designed to cut without leaving a trace, was a high-frequency trader who lived for the adrenaline of the gamble. And lately, his gambles had been failing with catastrophic frequency, leading him to view Benjamin not as a craftsman or a hero, but as a blue-collar nuisance, an intrusion that reminded him of the world of honest labor he had spent his life trying to escape. One humid afternoon, while Jennifer was away at a high-stakes board meeting in the city, Benjamin was working on the intricate ventilation system that ran behind the walls of the master library, and because the vents, designed in an era before modern soundproofing, acted as a natural acoustic channel, Benjamin suddenly found himself unwillingly eavesdropping on a conversation that chilled him more than any basement fire ever could. He heard Matthew, on a private, encrypted line, his voice dropping to a low, hissed tone that dripped with a malice Benjamin recognized from the darkest corners of the city's arson investigations, revealing that Matthew was unjust losing money, but was actively embezzling from Sterling Globo Logistics by moving millions into offshore accounts through a labyrinth of shell companies. And worse, the financial betrayal was only the beginning of the horror. For Benjamin heard Matthew laughing with a woman on the other end of the line, a woman he called his real partner, promising her that as soon as the final transfer was complete, he would trigger a scandal involving Jennifer's late father that would leave her reputation in ashes while leaving Matthew holding the keys to the kingdom. The weight of the secret felt like a lead vest on Benjamin. That's just as he climbed out of the crawl space with his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that if he told Jennifer, she might not believe him, since he was just a man she had met in an alley, while Matthew was the man she had shared a life with for nearly a decade. Consequently, Benjamin spent the next several days in a state of hypervigilance, observing Matthew's movements with the same intensity he used to scan a burning room for structural weak points, noting the way Matthew manipulated Jennifer by showering her with performative affection and expensive jewelry while secretly checking his watch or sending deleted messages under the table, realizing that Jennifer was being hunted again. But this time the predator was not a desperate kid in a dark alley, but a sophisticated monster sitting right across from her at the dinner table, driving Benjamin to document Matthew's late-night sessions in the home office in the specific times. He accessed the secure company servers, fueled by a deep, burning sense of injustice, as he watched a woman who was fundamentally trying to be better being dismantled by a man who valued nothing but his own ego. The tension finally reached a breaking point on the eve of the Sterling's 8th anniversary, a night for which Jennifer had planned a massive televised Emerald Gala to celebrate both their marriage and the completion of the estate's renovations. And when Benjamin caught Jennifer for a brief moment in the hallway away from the prying eyes of the staff amidst a house filled with florists, caterers, and the suffocating scent of expensive lilies, he tried to warn her, his voice a low, urgent murmur, urging her to look closer at the company's recent audits and to trust her instincts over her heart. But Jennifer, caught up in the stress of the event and the intoxicating gaslighting of Matthew, snapped at him with a coldness that felt like a physical blow, telling him to stay in his lane, accusing him of being bitter because he would never know the kind of love and luxury she possessed, and ordering him to finish his work and leave before the guests arrived. Taking the hit without flinching, Benjamin looked at her with eyes filled with a pity that stung her more than any insult could. Told her that he had seen 1,000 fires start from a single spark of negligence, and that right now her entire world was smoldering, and then turned and walked toward the service exit, leaving her standing in the center of her palace, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The night of the Emerald Gala arrived with a shimmering, artificial brilliance that seemed to mask the rot Benjamin had warned about. But for Jennifer Miller, the air inside her own home felt thinner than it ever had before as she stood at the top of the grand staircase, draped in a custom emerald silk gown that caught the light of the $300,000 crystal chandelier, looking every bit the untouchable monarch of the Sterling Empire, while below her 400 of Chicago's most influential figures drifted through the great hall, their laughter a dissonant melody against the soft jazz of the live orchestra. Matthew stood at the center of a circle of venture capitalists, his tuxedo fitting him like a second skin, his smile a masterpiece of predatory charm. Jennifer watched him, and for the first time in their 8-year marriage, she didn't see a partner. She saw a stranger wearing a mask. Benjamin's words about the smoldering fire in her life echoed in her mind, drowning out the music and the polite applause. Every time Matthew laughed, she saw the coldness in his eyes that Benjamin had described, and every time he reached out to touch her arm, she felt a phantom heat, as if the house itself were beginning to burn from the inside out. The weight of the evening was a physical pressure, a tightening in her chest that made it impossible to breathe. And as the clock struck 10, she realized she could no longer play the part of the blissful wife while her soul was screaming for the truth. She slipped away from the crowd, her movements frantic as she retreated to the sanctuary of her master library, the room where Benjamin had spent so many hours fixing the vents. The smell of sawdust and honest labor still lingered in the corners, a sharp contrast to the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive perfume that filled the rest of the house. She sat at her mahogany desk and opened a laptop that contained the master keys to Sterling Global's financial heart. Her hands shook as she navigated the complex layers of their accounts. Bypassing the curated reports, Matthew always insisted she read. As the raw data began to flow across the screen, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Benjamin was right. The discrepancies weren't just errors. They were a systematic dissection of her father's legacy. She saw the wire transfers, the forged signatures that looked hauntingly like her own, and the final, crushing blow, a massive transfer scheduled for midnight tonight that would leave the company's primary accounts empty. The betrayal was so absolute, so surgical, that she felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a realization that her entire life had been a carefully constructed lie maintained by the man she had trusted with her heart. The heavy oak door to the library swung shut with an ominous click, and Jennifer looked up to see Matthew standing there, the tuxedo no longer making him look like a gentleman but like a shark in dark water. He didn't look surprised to find her there. He looked bored, as if this confrontation were merely a tedious formality he had been expecting. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, and told her that she should have stayed at the party and enjoyed her final night as the Queen of Chicago. He confessed everything with a terrifying lack of remorse, explaining that he had never loved her, only the access her name provided. He told her that he had already planted the seeds of her downfall, leaking documents to the press that would suggest she had been the one embezzling the funds to cover a non-existent gambling addiction. By morning, he claimed, she would be a pariah, and he would be the tragic husband picking up the pieces of a broken empire. He moved toward her, his hand reaching out not to comfort her, but to seize the laptop, his face contorting into something unrecognizable and cruel. For a moment, Jennifer felt the old Paralysian fear, the sense that she was once again that woman in the dark alley, helpless and alone. But the darkness didn't win. The door didn't just open. It was shattered inward by a force of nature that Matthew Gonzalez was never prepared to face. Benjamin Adams didn't enter the room as a contractor or a firefighter. He entered as a guardian. He stepped into the light of the library, his presence instantly shrinking Matthew's perceived power. Benjamin had been waiting in the shadows of the estate, his firefighter's intuition telling him that the climax of this particular fire was imminent. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood two men in dark suits from the sex criminal investigation. Benjamin had known since they were children, playing on the streets of the South Side, men whose families he had saved from a burning tenement years ago. Benjamin looked at Matthew with a profound, quiet disgust and told him that a man who builds his house on a foundation of lies shouldn't be surprised when it collapses around him. He handed Jennifer a physical drive, a collection of recordings he had made from the ventilation shafts, and metadata he had recovered from Matthew's private server during his consultation hours. The arrest of Matthew Gonzalez was a silent affair that took place while the gala continued just a few hundred feet away. A poetic justice that saw the predator removed from his own den without a single guest noticing his departure, when the police finally led him away in handcuffs. Jennifer stood by the window and watched the red and blue lights fade into the lake forest mist. She turned to Benjamin, her emerald gown torn at the hem, her eyes red from tears that were finally clearing the smoke from her vision. She tried to offer him a check, a massive sum that would have changed his life forever, but she stopped herself. She realized that to offer Benjamin Adams money for saving her life a second time would be to insult the very thing that made him a hero. Instead, she walked over to him and did something she had done in years. She asked for help, not as a boss, not as a millionaire, but as a woman who realized that she had been living in a house of glass and was ready to start building something permanent. Benjamin didn't give her a speech. He just offered her his arm and walked her out of the library, past the statues and the paintings, and out into the cool, honest air of the midnight garden. The transformation of Jennifer Miller was the talk of the city for months, but the reality was far more quiet than the headlines suggested. She didn't just fire Matthew. She dismantled the culture of greed he had fostered. She sold the Lake Forest estate, realizing that a home with 30 rooms was just a very expensive cage for a woman who only needed one. She moved into a historic brownstone in a diverse, vibrant neighborhood closer to the people her company actually served. She used the remains of her fortune to establish the Miller Sterling Foundation, a multi-million-dollar initiative that provided mental health resources, housing assistance, and scholarships for the children of fallen first responders. She became a regular at the Firehouse Kitchen, no longer a diamond-clad intruder, but a friend who knew how the crew liked their coffee and was unafraid to roll up her sleeves and help with the dishes. She had learned that the true measure of a destiny is not the height of the skyscraper you own, but the depth of the roots you grow in the soil of your community. The story reached its true emotional resolution, not in a boardroom, but at that same quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Chicago where it had almost ended. 6 months after the gala, Benjamin and Jennifer stood together before Joshua's grave. The marble was gleaming, polished to a mirror finished by the flour and sugar Benjamin still used every month. This time, there were 3 bottles of high-quality bourbon sitting on the ledge. Benjamin poured the first for Joshua, the second for the man he used to be, one who thought he had to carry his grief alone in. Jennifer poured the third. She poured it for the woman who had died in that alleyway, the one who thought money was a shield against the world. They stood in the silence of the afternoon, the Chicago wind no longer biting but feeling like a clean slate. Benjamin reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm a reminder of the work they still had to do, and Jennifer squeezed back, knowing that, for the first time in 39 years, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They had both been changed by the fire, but they hadn't been consumed. They had been forged into something stronger, something that would last long after the emeralds and the galas were forgotten. We are so incredibly grateful that you chose to spend your time with us today, listening to this journey of Benjamin and Jennifer. It is a warm privilege to share these stories of the human spirit with you, and we invite you to join our growing community of heart-centered viewers by clicking that subscribe button. We want to keep building this space with you one story at a time. We'd love to know which city or corner of the world you're rewatching from today. Please share your location in the comments so we can welcome you properly. And finally, we'd love to hear your heart on this. Did you enjoy this story? And what was the one lesson that stayed with you after the final scene? Whether it's about the power of truth or the beauty of a second chance, your reflections make this community what it is. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.